Jesus stood in stark distinction to both Islam and in the way the Judaizers were using the law. He never came to destroy the law. He made that very clear. He came to establish it.
Islamic law and ancient Jewish law contain extensive regulations for numerous aspects of life. When God reduced the law to 10 commandments, did he oversimplify the moral code? Can 10 moral laws truly impact a culture? Hear the answer to that question and more today with author and apologist Ravi Zacharias. Welcome back to Just Thinking. Several years ago, Ravi delivered an open forum at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The broadcast you're about to hear is taken from the Q&A he held after his talk. His first question comes from a Muslim student who asked a question you may not often hear. Does Christian morality not go far enough? Here's that question.
I'm not a Christian, I'm a Muslim, so pardon my questions. The 10 Commandments you talked about certainly provide a very enlightening spiritual guide for people. But as a society, compared to the Mosaic Law, where it has a single law for every single thing you're ever bound to do, I see that really the laws that Jesus came with, the code of life he came up with.
Sorry, code of?
The code of life that he's supposed to have given us is not sufficient to envelop society like Jewish law or Islamic law. How do you think Christianity can fix the world if the absolute law that you demand is not present in Christianity itself? You can't love thy neighbor and love thy father and just bring it on from there.
Okay, good question. And did you say you're not a Christian but you're a Muslim?
I'm a Muslim, yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that, sir, and thanks for asking. I think it's a wonderful question, and I can see actually why you would even raise it, because when you look at the Islamic code, everything is enjoined, everything is described, from your diet and your fasting and all of that. It is all enshrined in and all the way up to the Sharia and the code and the law, etc. Jesus stood in stark distinction to both Islam and in the way the Judaizers were using the law. He never came to destroy the law. He made that very clear. He came to establish it. What he reminded us is that by the keeping of the law, no flesh can be justified. This is a fundamental difference between Islam and Christianity. That in my faith, I can be absolutely certain that I am forgiven. Not because I am righteous. For you it would be purely the will of Allah whether He chooses to grant you that salvation or not. But don't ever forget that what Jesus actually said was transcend the written law in any way. For example, He says, you say, you shall not commit adultery. He said, I'm telling you, if you look upon a woman with lust, you have already committed adultery in your heart. He has already established that now on a higher plane. He says, if you hate somebody, you've already committed murder. If anything, He establishes it on a higher plane than either the Quranic law or the Judaizers would have used. So let me take you to what I think is a classic response to your question. If you take the Sermon on the Mount and see what Jesus said is the characteristic of the child of the kingdom, you've got there inscripted not only what the moral boundaries are, it's not my law, by the way, what the moral boundaries are, but how only by the change of heart and beginning with the poverty of spirit can you come into that relationship and live as a child of the kingdom. For example, when He took the whole story of the Good Samaritan, the person questioning Jesus said, who is my neighbor? Did you notice? Do you remember how Jesus answered that? He basically answered it not by telling him who his neighbor was, but to whom are you being neighborly? He said it again on a higher plane. So I think the difference between, say, what you are raising for me And what the Christian faith would give to you is that the Christian faith is not devoid of a moral law. It sets it on a higher plane and reminds you and me that we cannot keep it in and of ourselves. Jesus described the moral law as a mirror. You can look at a mirror and find out that your face is dirty, but you don't go and rub your face on the mirror to clean it. So you go to something other than the mirror, and the law, says the Apostle Paul, is a schoolmaster. If anybody knew what the moral law was, it was the Apostle Paul. And he found out at the end that it was only the grace of God and the mercy of God that was able to give him salvation. It doesn't deny the law, it affirms it, and shows ultimately the impossibility for you and me to keep it. So it does not destroy the law. It shows that he alone completely fulfilled it. No one else ever did.
I want to ask you, you mentioned that the terrorist networks, one of the things they fear most is a nation that would stand for a moral foundation. And one question of morality today is violence and war. And my question to you is, in the framework of Christianity, do you believe that God ordains violence and war at times? And if so, what would be the guidelines for that justification?
For war and violence? Okay. Well, it's a sobering question, isn't it? Because it's once upon a time, we could, even as much as 3 years ago, we could have asked this theoretically. Now we don't ask it theoretically anymore. We ask it with deep sense of respect for what the ramifications are upon this. So let me begin by showing you one or two, for example, fundamental differences. When you deal with the whole area of war and attack and violence, we have to look at it in two ways. My next book in the Great Conversation series, first was Lotus on the Cross, Jesus talks to Buddha. Next is Sense and Sensuality, Jesus talks to Oscar Wilde. The third one coming out end of the year is Jesus talking to Hitler. And I'm dealing with the whole nature of violence. Violence is prevalent everywhere in our world. I was in Russia along with Bill Craig. It's a country completely out of control. Violence is there. The moment I desacralize another life, I'm violent towards that life. I can take it. And, I said to a man who was arguing with me while we were discussing this in a country where they were defending what the terrorists did on September 11th, I said to him, are you aware of how many poor people have suffered because of this? I said, you think you've attacked America and the rich in those tower buildings. I said, I was in Bangkok on the day it happened. I said, I want you to know there are men and women on the streets of Bangkok who have no jobs today because of that. They have no food today because of that. The woman who sells T-shirts, the little lad who carries soup to someplace. Overnight, the hotels were emptied from 100% to 15% capacity. I said, are you aware of all the suffering that comes from this? And the more we talked, I realized the parameters of suffering were just not there within the framework of this man's thinking. The starting principle is this, that life is sacred. When you start with that, then you move to the nature of war. That there are 3 or 4 theories of war that are prevalent. And one of them held by many is called the just war theory. That if life is being desacralized by an individual or by a group of people, then in the hierarchy of your choices there, in order to protect the sanctity of that life that is under your care or protection, you may have to go to the battlefield to protect that which is your trust and that which is your commitment. For example, if my son or my daughter were attacked by a band full of thugs on the road, I'd go down fighting. Even if it meant I'd pay with my life, I'd do it. I would not want my children, my family, I would actually go and help a stranger if I had to, because you're protecting the sacredness of life. It is so interesting that the many people sometimes who argue against that can't get along with their own neighbor or their own spouse and, fight it out and live so unpeaceably with people around them. All I'm saying to you is war is never a desirable end. But if life is sacred and needs to be protected, I am of the conviction that there is a just war. I was in Vietnam and Cambodia during the war. I was only in my 20s, but I went more working with the chaplains. And any time I'm called upon to serve in those roles, I will go. But I also believe that for nations' sovereignty and self-determination, there are men and women who have to pay with their lives, for whom we stand always grateful, who protect the transcending reason for being, which is the sacredness of life itself. And to keep from that sacredness being violated, they take to the task of defending. When God, in His sovereign will, allows that to happen, remember two things. Number one, that tragedy and destruction can sometimes come because it is the logical outworking of lives that are not living by His imperative. And number two, when God is behind some event where even when a life is taken, don't ever forget that He has the right to restore that life as well. He can restore that life. So when the one who gave it is sovereign over it being taken, He restores that life. And ultimately your destiny is those who have you bent your knee to Him and He says to him, your will be done, or you say to Him, your will be done, or you refuse to bend that knee to Him and He says to you, all right then, your will be done. And those were the words of C.S. Lewis. The ultimate separation from God is the logical outworking of a will that will not bend its knee to God Himself. War is part of the human framework that nobody wants to see. But if life is being desacralized, the righteous will rise to the fore to protect the right of every human being to his or her sacred right to live. And when that's being violated, unfortunately, the entailments are not pleasant.